Hello and welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really excited to welcome back onto the show, Mallory McDuff. Mallory, thanks for making time for us.
No, it's great to be here.
So yeah, it must have been about a year and a half ago that we had you on, and we were talking about your book, Our Last Best Act. Beautiful book, and somehow you managed to put together another one in a very short amount of time, really. And it's a really beautiful book. It's called Love Your Mother: 50 States, 50 Stories, and 50 Women United for Climate Justice. So I'm excited to chat with you about it. First, for people who don't know you, you're an author, a mother, an educator, and you teach environmental education at Warren Wilson College, which is just outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And your writing stems from your experience raising children, experience teaching students, and really just embracing the uncertainty of living in a changing climate. So always enjoy your writing and really like what I've seen from this new book. I've read a little of it, but so much going on. So I guess first, just tell us, what is it? It's a book of climate storytelling, but it's about 50 women, each one representing one of the states in the United States.
Exactly. And both of these books, or Our Last Best Act, is a book about the choices we make for our bodies, after we die. And both books were published by Broadleaf Books. And so when I got the contract for Our Last Best Act, they were interested in two books. And I was interested in writing. So I was like, oh, sure, I can do two books. And having a goal and having a deadline is super motivating. And so this book really, it stemmed from what you said, what I'm trying to write from, the place I'm trying to write from in my essays and in my books is the intersection of everyday life with the climate crisis. And as you said, I'm a mom, I'm a teacher, I'm around young people almost all the time. It's like, um, and and so, my everyday life is I'm not negotiating, treaties, or I'm not, a politician. My everyday life is what am I going to do when I walk into the classroom, and what am I going to cook for dinner, and is the teenager talking to me today? Are they not? Just like these pretty basic, all-consuming parts of life. And concurrent with that is the reality of the climate crisis. I mean, for right now, it's like a gorgeous day on campus where I live in this little 900 square foot duplex. And yet, we know this gorgeous spring day is the first week of March. I mean, it's hitting everybody, I think, in the South, at least where I reside. Is like, okay, this is not normal. If we love it because it's really beautiful, and something is wrong. And so I wrote Love Your Mother. I wanted stories that would be inspiring for my students as well as my daughters. And I wanted a diversity of stories. So, for example, if I had a student who came from a rural background in Idaho, for example, I could say, oh my gosh, here's somebody whose work you should look at, or whose life you should look at. And the funny thing is that I thought, oh, okay, 100 people, that's too many. 25 is not enough. And so I cut to 50. And the friend whose idea it was to write this specific book, her name is Jill Driswicki, she was like, 50 women? Well, of course you're going to do one from each state. That's why we need creative friends, right? Because that had not crossed my mind. And so that was the impetus, for looking at one woman from each state.
That's cool. Yeah, I like that. And the way that the book is organized is, regionally. So you really get kind of a feeling for the places of the United States. And I also like, in the introduction, you're talking about all the interviewing that you did for this, and that you kind of started to refer to people as like Miss Maine and Miss Oregon.
Yeah.
And like, oh, we'll have to make a sash for you.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and it's kind of funny, I don't tell many of my students this because they can be very, um, they're so progressive that sometimes that leans towards judgmental, but I was actually top 10 for junior miss of Alabama
Oh,
in
really?
1984. And so I don't wear that on my sleeve, but at the, it did become just a way of vernacular for myself. A friend would call and I would say, I can't talk right now. I'm about to, interview Miss Kansas, or, I'm about to interview Miss Indiana. And so I was kind of embarrassed by this because, obviously in a increasingly non-binary world, referring to people by Ms. is, not really, it's not common on Warren Wilson campus. But it became kind of a funny thing. And as I write in the book, Lou Weber, who is one of the women I profiled in the book, and she's got this huge extended family in Indiana, and she said her whole family was going to, after the book came out, they were going to make her a photovoltaic sash, with Miss Indiana, and I write about that in the introduction. So that's been, it's been kind of fun to think about. For me, a lot of the climate coverage that we see just online on social media is often from places that maybe not a lot of people could relate to. For example, it might be from New York or California. And I grew up in Alabama, on the coast of Alabama, and now live in North Carolina. And so part of this, my goal was I wanted to write stories about some of the more well-known climate leaders, from Catherine Hayhoe to Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. I wanted that name recognition, mainly because I wanted to write about them. It was kind of a good excuse. But I also wanted people who were not well known, and more of the people are not like everyday household names if you read a lot about the climate. And that was really important to me. I think especially for the life that I live, and my daughters live. They're not, they go to the local public high school. They're not jetting off to LA or DC, you know. And so that was a touch point for me, a touchstone rather, was to have a diversity of geographic regions, obviously with the states, but also a diversity of vocations. Half the women are BIPOC, and that just kind of, I didn't have a number I was going for. It just kind of ended up that
Mm.
way, and which felt appropriate given the disproportionate impact, of the climate on people of color and indigenous folks. So, but it was fun. I mean, I was like, oh my gosh, how am I going to finish this? Because I was still doing speaking events for our last best act, and I still am. And because that's an issue, sustainability and death. It's never going to go away. So I'm still doing speaking events for that book, but I was like, I'm going to get overwhelmed if I think about it, and I have to really use like Anne Lamott's bird by bird. Like for me, it was state by state. So I had my list of the states, and I just like did not look up. Like, just, and ultimately you can finish a project that way.
Yeah, I'm impressed because I don't know. I'll try and take on multiple projects like that, and it's just one ends up going to the back burner. So
Yeah,
it's
well, I
really
did one, and
tremendous.
then yeah, it was. I think the other reason that it was, that I was able to do it was because I was, with every little profile, every story I was writing, for many of them, I was gaining new friends, and so the process was actually mirroring what I was hearing in their stories. I mean,
Mm.
these women, are really good at working together. I mean, like collaboration was like one of the major themes of the book to me. And so as I was, talking to people, I realized we would talk about their work, and then suddenly, we'd be talking about whatever, having teenagers in COVID, and or just like life stuff. And I realized okay, wait, we're becoming allies for each other. And this is the writing and research process is mimicking what I was finding in the stories, which was like, you know, really cool.
Yeah, I appreciate that so much. As you know, as an academic, we all struggle to make writing that's meaningful, that can connect with people, and to see a book like this that really does mirror the kind of collaboration that climate justice is all about, of, building alliances, building solidarity, making it about our everyday lives and not just high-minded concepts. Like, oh, this is the kind of writing we need. It's important that people are still doing like just boring monographs and stuff. We still need that. No offense to those folks. But there's something that's just a little more, I don't know, I guess relational about it. It doesn't feel like it's just about you and your ideas. It is about all these women. So I wonder if you
Right.
could say a little bit more about the fact that it's women, because of course, along with the disproportionate impacts that BIPOC suffer due to climate change, ecofeminists have been saying for decades also, we really need to think about the central role that women play in these kind of struggles.
Right. And we know that 80% of the people who are displaced by climate disasters are women and girls. And so that disproportionate impact is seen on women globally. And one of the books that really inspired me was All We Can Save, which is an anthology I'm sure that you're familiar with, edited by Catherine Wilkinson and Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. And it's an anthology of contributed writings. And one of the lines in that book that really was just a beacon for me was, the climate crisis is not gender neutral. And so that really was a driving force for me. And again, this friend Jill Jerswicki, who is it was you really helped me to center that at the beginning of the project. She is she's she's from Wisconsin, from a small town, Appleton, Wisconsin, which is a very small town. But she's living in Rome, Italy, and she's a gender responsive specialist with Jesuit refugee services. So she's traveling, to refugee camps in Malawi, all over the continent of Africa, and seeing that the impacts of that displacement, firsthand, and specifically as it relates to the education of girls. And in the introduction, I also point to that the importance of education of girls as being and women as being one of those major factors that can help to mitigate the climate crisis. And Catherine Wilkinson, some of her original one of her TED talks, for which she's most well known, was about that intersection of gender and climate, and so that really, that was like um, that was the magnet of the book. Um, was to identify people who identify as women from each state, and then write their story. And there is at least one non-binary Indigenous leader in the book
Mm.
as well. But I when I started, I mean, for me, like structure is I'm like a Capricorn. I like have to have the structure before I can have the creativity, um, which is not everybody's not like that. But for me, I really I had to figure out like how am I going to structure each of these stories so there's kind of a parallel format that the reader may not even be aware of, but that could allow me to package each story in about 3 pages. And so how I did that was, or how I decided to do it, was I started like in the middle with that person in the middle of the work that they were doing, and then shifted to their background, how did they get there, and then ended with what are their next steps, what is this, what's this impact, where is this going, their work. So I kind of had that roadmap for every story, where I knew I wanted to open with the action, reflect to their past, and then move toward next steps. And so for me, that was super helpful, as I talked to people.
Yeah, I like that a lot. The kind of narrative arc, especially because I mean, each of these people could you could write so much
Oh
about, and
God.
interviewing them, that's so much material from the interview. So that's one of the really impressive things reading this is like, how did you condense all of this into just a few pages per person? It's so like tightly succinct. So yeah, that structure seems to be kind of the secret sauce to keeping
Yeah,
it,
it helped me.
digestible.
Yeah, it helped me. And there were, to be clear, there were some people that were either so well known or just not accessible. There were some people that I ended up using secondary sources to write their story. For example, Rihanna Gunn Wright, who was really created the Green New Deal. She wrote me back and was like, "I'm really busy now, and you know whatever you write is fine." and so I have the sources for each story in the back. Um, so there were some people that I used, and I'm upfront with that in the author's note in the beginning. But the majority of people I was able to interview, or else they read their story and made changes for accuracy.
Oh, nice. That's good. So yeah,
Yes.
so you circulate the
So
stories back to the interviewees.
right. I mean, there was one like Amanda Gorman. I wrote about. I really wanted to write about a poet, and I wanted to write about a younger poet, and so I wrote about her for California, and focusing on her poetry that does um, have themes of climate. And she's I could not get a hold. She's so well known, and there's so much written about her. So she was one person who didn't read their story, but most everybody else read their story and made changes based for accuracy, or whatnot. So that was, yeah, it was honestly a process of like really hitting people up on social media. And people didn't know me from anybody else, and so some of the people I had connections to, but some I was just like on Instagram, like I'll hit you up with your DM. And yeah, the generosity of people to respond is crazy. Yeah, these are people who have full lives. And so I was really um, touched by the generosity of people to be honest and say, I can't, just to be honest with where they were. But in most cases, they were, just open to either being interviewed or reading their story, or, yeah. And
Yeah.
that was really cool because we're all
Yeah.
busy. Maybe that's like
All
because we're
right.
women, we just say yes.
That's a good point. Yeah, very agreeable. Like, okay, no, I'll take
We're
on the extra project.
generous. It's for the cause. Yeah. It's fun. It's
That's
funny.
true. Yeah, I'd be curious if writing a book that was, 50 men, one from each state,
Yeah.
how how many of those emails and DMs would you get a response to, and how
Yeah.
generous are people going to be with their time? I'd be
I mean,
curious.
we're generalizing, but I do think people were, um, yeah, these women were amazingly generous. And it was important to me to have a diversity of vocations, and because I do think it's going to take a million different solutions. It's not like one thing. So and I think that just to say, like, there's poets, farmers. We have a lot of farmers. I mean, at least four different farmers: an oceanographer, students, a physician, community organizers, a sculptor, writers. Just a death doula. I'm not a death doula, a birth doula. I'm getting my books confused. Attorneys. So just the diversity of ways we can enter into the climate movement, I think really impressed me.
Yeah, right. So many times people think, oh, well, the only way is to be a climate activist or environmental lawyer. It's like, no, anything,
Yeah,
whatever you're doing in life, there's a way to kind of turn it toward climate justice. So yeah, I
right,
think that's really inspiring, and the fact that it's all 50 states too. It's like, no, it's not just coastal elites who care about these things. It's really
right.
everybody. It's not just Democrats or something. It's like, no, most people want a clean world, to live in. So yeah, you really get a sense of how universal these issues are, and it somehow doesn't seem heavy. It's a very hopeful book. It's very positive, solutions oriented, and
Mhm.
I don't know, I mean, similarly with your last book, you're dealing with heavy topics, and in this case, it's very uplifting. So personally, that's one of the reasons I'm already recommending this book to so many people. I know people who are very distressed about climate change, and the only option is to just not think about it, out of sight, out of mind, and that kind of thing. It's like, no, there's a way to think about it that can actually be uplifting and empowering. And I think this book
Right.
does that very well.
Well, I've particularly being around college students all the time. Like I go to work and I'm around college students. I come home and I have a 24 and a 17-year-old. So I feel like I'm with this demographic a lot. And actually my older daughter just went to Peace Corps just 2 days ago.
Oh,
So we're down one in the 900 square foot little house, rental on campus. But so much of what I feel like I do is trying to not deny like their feelings of overwhelm or being overwhelmed, because I feel that too. That book, Britt Way's book, Generation Dread, you
yep.
know, points to this generation, and the impact um, of the climate on anxiety, on mental health, and but the point is not like, okay, you end there. For me, I've really seen with my students, at least, that engaging in local community action is kind of the way to harness that anxiety into something that is positive. And in our case, since I teach environmental education, we're working in local schools, or we're doing workshops for adults, and it's very hands-on, it's very experiential. But even with all that, I mean, I've been at Warren Wilson, and I taught for a year at Colorado State before that, but I've been at Warren Wilson for 23 years.
Wow.
I mean, that's like longer than most of my students have been alive. So, which they remind me of. Um, but even with that, like as a vocation, I mean, half the time I'm like, I don't know if what I'm doing is making a difference. I mean, what the heck? I don't know. Um, and so, in a large part, I think this book was also for me, as a way to say the everyday work of engaging where your values intersect with the climate crisis, that work in collective can make a difference. So the idea that the individual is going to have this huge impact, I think that to me makes me want to just like you know like get a pizza and like zone out on Twitter for 2 hours. Um, but the idea that I can engage and find people that share values that intersect with climate, and then that collective force can make a difference. That's where I really felt momentum in doing these interviews, and writing these stories. I mean, it's just amazing what these women have done, and not individually, but how they've harnessed this collective action. I think about Tara Huska, from Minnesota, who she's an Ojibwe attorney and has been really instrumental in trying to stop the Line 3 tar sands pipeline. And I think about in Alaska, um, indigenous groups who have really been instrumental with pressuring banks to divest from fossil fuel infrastructure. And now we see, coming up March 21st, Bill McKibben's group, Third Act, it's people over 60, and they're gathering and they are pressuring banks to divest from fossil fuel projects. And so this is like, to me, it's like, okay, this is something that starts as one thing, then generates momentum that then has a collective impact. And if we don't believe in that, I think we really are screwed, because I mean, we know that it's like 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global greenhouse emissions. So with that, so like, what the hell? Like, yeah, like, you know, open a Dr. Pepper and just call it a day. Um, but but if we can see, like watching that third act, I just got a call yesterday from an Asheville group, um, affiliate of Third Act, and they're organizing an action in downtown Asheville, and they're walking into the banks and Bank of America, and they are saying we will withdraw our money, or they're, even if somebody doesn't want to withdraw our money, they're collectively putting pressure on these institutions, and it's just, to me, to realize, okay, all of that is not, it just didn't like germinate from nowhere. It started from people, hey, this tactic, maybe it's not working, are pressuring the politicians, so let's go after the banks. And it's just amazing to see the growth of those different tactics.
Yeah, right. And it's such a short amount of time. So much has changed the last 5 years, last 10 years, compared to, I mean, think of somebody like Bill McKibben, he was working on this right when we hit 350 parts per million. He was there.
Yeah,
And,
start. Oh, yeah,
then gradually you start to really see a movement. And especially in this book, you're like, well, the whole United States is really changing. And we don't necessarily see that in our overall, fossil fuel emissions, but we see this grassroots movement happening of different kinds of organizations, different people, different communities, and it really is taking off. It's so important for people to know that. Otherwise, it just looks like bad news. It looks like, oh, the climate's just getting worse. It's like, well, yeah, of course, we have these problems, but the solutions are happening, like catching
yeah,
on, like wildfire, which is probably a bad
yeah.
metaphor.
Well, and
But
I mean, I remember Bill McKibben has come to Warren Wilson twice since I've been here, and he came right after he started 350.org, and he was I mean, this was years ago, and this was like everybody had a pre cell phone, really. I mean, they existed, but not. So he was walking around with an iPad, communicating with people all over the world. It was like a big collective art installation all over the world. And I mean, I think it's like there is movement, and there is obstruction, from, and so reconciling those two, I think, is for me, is the tenuous piece. Like, how can you, okay, like 10 years ago when I was trying to write about climate, and if you put the word climate in their title, like, publishers didn't want it. um, and so there is an awareness, um, and there are these huge institutional and systemic obstacles, and so recognizing that it's not going to be all one or the other. I think that's that's what I try to talk to students about. But honestly, for me, I've really think with teaching that I've kind of not reverted, but I think I am more into students doing community-based projects than talking about it a lot. We get in there and we're doing things because I just feel like that is, they're learning more skills. They're in their heads a lot and on social media. I mean, I am too. So that being in community partnerships, and seeing those grassroots impacts, is kind of where I've leaned into with my teaching. But
yeah.
That's kind of diverting a bit.
Yeah, well, it
So
really speaks to, as you said, one of the main themes of the book that kind of just happened organically was collaboration. And that it is like one of the key solutions to the climate crisis is, don't just get stuck in your head, and don't just think of yourself as an individual. Think of yourself as a
right,
community member. And we
yeah,
do always get stuck, oh, there's massive systemic change needs to happen, but I'm just one individual. we forget there's that nice middle ground called community. And when you
Right.
engage in community, that's how real change happens.
Yeah, there were three kind of take homes that from for me from all this engagement with these women, and one was the collaboration piece. But the first part was actually like communication. And I think, and Catherine Hayhoe, who's one of the best known climate scientists and climate communicators, in the and definitely in the U.S. and also in the world, she keeps saying the most important thing you can do about the climate is to talk about it. And that, it kind of freed me from feeling like, oh shoot, like, like, look at the plastic in my recycling bin, like, oh my God, like that whole individual thing that is so messed up. But so when, if you listen to Catherine Hayhoe's TED Talk, where she talks about the most important thing you can do about climate is to talk about it, I really took that as just like this personal mission. And just talking about climate in the grocery store with, I go to the same checkout person, and she and I are like, about the same age, and we always chat. And the interactions in our daily life, like that is something I don't have to be a scientist to like explain climate science, to like talk about spring being like crazy. Wow, this is like really early. I can talk about that with anybody, and I don't need to be some expert. I can just be a person in
Yeah.
this community. So the communication is a big one that I found in all of the stories. And Catherine Hayhoe also says, that most people don't hear family and friends talk about the climate in their everyday lives. And that's changing a bit. But that is really like empowering to me because I can talk, like, um, and talk without having to be an expert. So the communication was one thing, and then the collaboration, like joining an organization or joining with people that share values that intersect with the climate. And then the third is what you mentioned, like just community, and sometimes that can mean pressuring elected officials in your community, because we tend to think about, oh, who's in DC, but the county elected officials, the local elected officials, state elected officials, they're having a huge impact on climate decisions. So that pressure in community and advocating for values in community is really that third, not just collaborating in community, but also putting pressure and letting elected officials know that this matters.
Yeah. Yeah, people really forget that. They're like, oh, it's, the president has to do something. Like, actually, you can do a tremendous amount at the local level. And yeah, local politics really does matter. Um,
Well,
and
and I'm yeah. Go ahead.
oh
I'm
no,
sorry.
please.
I was going to say that I was this, like, I can say that, and also I'm also somebody that might see, oh, you need to call your county commissioners, and I'm the first person to be like, oh God, I got to go to class. I'm busy. Um, but just what I saw in these women were those three things: the communication, collaboration, and community. Um, and that really, it made me realize, okay, these things, it's nobody's asking me, like you said, to protest every day in downtown Asheville, because I can't do that. I can go to a few protests, and I do, but those three things, like I can do those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So
like collaboration, community, communication. They're all co-words. It's all just
oh,
about being with, right?
that's true. Oh my God, that's really, I didn't realize that's true. I'm gonna write that down, Sam.
Yeah, because when you think about the kind of eco-feminist point that women
Yeah,
tend to have a kind of relational ethic and things, it's just about being with, and
yeah.
that we're not alone. And yeah, not everybody has to be like a full-time activist and those kinds of things. You don't have to be out there protesting and marching all the time. Each of us are going to have our own way to be with. And whoever that is, whatever your vocation is, whatever part of the country you're in or part of the world, we all have that leverage. Just be with the people around you and talk.
Right. Right. One of the things that was really interesting to me um, was research that showed, we tend to think in this country, not necessarily in other countries, but research that showed, we in the U.S. we think about political affiliations as consistent with um, I don't want to say beliefs, but attitudes toward climate change. And that is true. But the research also shows that political identities are not necessarily our strongest identity.
Mm,
So if we can connect with people, not necessarily Democrats or Republicans, but for example, I'm a member of an Episcopal church. So there are values that are consistent with my faith that I can connect with, and without talking about politics, without
right.
even knowing what people's political identity is. And so if I can connect as a person of faith, caring for creation, then that is one strategy for circumventing this, what is true, this political, deep political divide. And I think for me, like before reading that, I thought about, oh, the political divide. It's like done, like I can't do anything about it. But to think that I can connect with like parents, who want their kids to drink clean water and breathe clean air, that's irregardless of political affiliation.
Yeah. No, that's
Unless
such
you're
a
like
good
an
point.
extremist. I mean, that's
That's
that's.
true.
But there were several stories that highlighted this organization, Moms Clean Air Force, which is it's a national group, um, but of mothers who protecting clean air and clean water for their children. I mean, that's their number one value, and that is
Yeah.
intersectional with climate.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, well, I forget the number. It was something like 8 to 10 million people die per year due to air pollution related to fossil fuel production. Just
Yeah,
fossil fuel production, not other kinds of air pollution. Just the fossil fuel production is already killing millions. And so
right.
it's like, yeah, it's not about necessarily saving nature. It's kind of like the Catherine Hayhoe book, Saving Us,
Hmm.
right? They're like, no,
Right.
this is about us. Like, do you want your kids to have clean air? They're like, oh yeah, you'll get bipartisan agreement on that. Most people
We
want
hope.
breathable air. I know, right?
Right.
Except for a few
Yeah.
extremists.
Right.
There's always going to be those people. But yeah, for the
Right.
most part, and I like that point that our political identities aren't necessarily our strongest. That's something like your faith, or I would even think talking to farmers. And it's like this
Hmm.
is just our land. This doesn't, who cares about left or right on the political spectrum? We're just trying to take care of our land here.
Right. Right. Or the region you're from. I mean, that's
Yeah.
another strong um, identity for many people.
Yeah, I think I grew up in Texas and currently living in the San Francisco Bay Area. And a lot of times when I tell people I'm from Texas, they're like, "Well, how would you ever get interested in the environment?" I'm like,
Oh
"They
yeah.
they care about their environment in their own way, and
Oh yeah.
it's not California doesn't own environmental concern, and people are
Yeah.
just shocked to learn that sometimes."
Oh no, totally. Yeah, my sister is well, she grew up in Alabama, but she and her um, husband lived in Georgia for he grew up in Georgia, but he's a transportation planner for the city of Seattle, and my sister teaches first grade. And people are like, "What? You're a Democrat? You're from Alabama?" Like, you know, it's just yeah. But that's part of yeah, part of this. Bringing it back to the book too is that part of this book is I wanted to um, I don't know, like not dispel stereotypes, but explore affinities, you know, that were across regions. One of the stories that I love the most, and have, I'm now like pitching essays that are related to the book, and I've used the example a few times of Anna Jane Joyner, who is she lives in Alabama, and she used to live in Asheville. So I knew her,
Mm.
um, when she lived in Asheville, and she did like creation care work, um, like 10 years ago, and is now she's started a organization called Good Energy, which is a great name.
That's good.
And yeah, I was like, anytime you hear a good name, it's like, oh,
Yeah, that's a
that was
good
some
one.
good brain work there. But so Anna Jane lives in Perdido Beach, Alabama, which is right on the coastline, which is where I grew up, like, sailing and swimming and just really being in the water. A lot of people before the hurricanes, people didn't know Alabama had a coastline, but they do now. And
Right.
the oil spill that, but this Anna Jane's Good Energy project, um, she's what they are doing is they are consulting and educating Hollywood film and TV producers to integrate realistic, accurate climate narratives
Mm.
into their or storylines into their existing plots. And so, she has experienced, hurricanes on the coast where she had to evacuate in the middle of the hurricane. I mean, just, really traumatic natural disasters. And she said to me, how is it that I had this year, a particular year, um, where there were however many hurricanes there were, but all the TV and movies I've seen have no, it's like it's not even happening. And she's not, or if it does, it's like this huge apocalyptic, you know,
Right.
craziness. And so it's been so interesting to follow her story because Good Energy has they've put out a guide. It's like a guidebook, a playbook. It's called to climate storytelling, in TV and film, and they're getting real traction and big name stars who are promoting it. And anyway, it's just like fascinating. Okay, that is a big impact
Yeah.
because what we consume impacts who we are.
Yeah.
I mean, not what we consume, like the media we
Right.
consume.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Wow.
anyways,
No, that's big.
yeah. So
Yeah, that's
super interesting.
that's very interesting. Yeah, I'll have to keep up with that. Yeah, because I would imagine plenty of actors and script writers, they're like, oh yeah, we're trying to write better stories. So having a little playbook to
Oh
facilitate
yeah.
that, that's a fantastic idea.
Well, and it's not just she's not just trying to be like, oh, you're going to have a whole plot line that's climate, but that's one approach. But also, how can you intersperse climate threads into whatever the existing story is. And they did a study, they commissioned a study to look at what percentage of scripted TV and movies had any reference to global warming, climate change, and it was negligible.
Hmm.
And so their goal, I mean, they have a quantitative goal to increase that amount, by 50%. And I can't remember the year, but
Wow.
so it's a measurable goal, and they've got a qualitative and quantitative product that they're um, that they're marketing to an audience that actually wants to do the right thing.
Yeah, that's
So
fantastic. What a great example of the best thing you can do about climate change is talk about it.
yeah, I
Yeah.
know. Like, yeah, it's so fascinating. So that's been fun to like amplify. I mean, she doesn't need my help amplifying her story, but it's been fun to write about someone from Alabama that's doing that work. That it kind of is coming back to our stereotypes. People might think, oh, that person's going to be in California.
Yeah.
Well, no, she
Must be in
actually,
Hollywood or something.
yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's kind of neat.
Yeah, no, I think so. Very neat. And, really speaks to what your book is all about, which is climate storytelling. That we talk a lot about communication in general, but there's something really powerful about story. So I
Hmm.
wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit, because there's so many ways you could have profiled these people. It could have been more like just biographies of them, right? And you could have approached it more like a climate scientist or something. But instead, the focus is story, where you think about, the person's past, what they're doing now, and then what their future is. You know, stories are always like that. You have that past, present, and future.
Right.
So story. I mean, as a writer in general, you know, uh, the boundary between storytelling versus just talking about facts is, you know, can be blurred a little, but it's so important to lean on story.
Mhm.
So where's storytelling in your life? Where's why storytelling for this book?
Right.
Stories, narratives.
Well, I think I'm from the South, so you are too. Um, um, yeah, so I think story is how I learn, how I communicate, but it's not. It wasn't really about me. I mean, I think but I think that's kind of the lens that I brought to this project. It's interesting though. I just read an interview with Anna Jane Joyner, and she said, I mean, she's I know her personally, but I just read another interview from by her with her, and she actually said she's leaning away from the term climate storytelling, which is interesting. Um, that she's now just talking about how to integrate climate into the existing story,
Mhm.
and so for me with when I talk to these women, I guess as a person, I mean, not necessarily like as a writer or as a teacher, like just as a person, like I'm just like hyper curious about people's stories. Like I wish I could turn off, but I am the person that if I'm at a restaurant or a bar, like I'm listening, even when I'm not trying to listen, but I hear other people's stories and then want to share them with my children who are not necessarily interested. in, um, so I think that lens is how we've shared knowledge and wisdom over years, and the research does also support the fact that people learn and remember through stories. um, so I probably had no other way um, to enter into these women's lives than to try to tell a story, and to try to I was working to try to tell a story that some readers might be able to see themselves in. you
Right,
know
right. That's a good way to put it. That with a story, you can kind of see yourself in the story, and like you
yeah,
can kind of think, oh yeah, I can see myself in that context or playing these different roles, and yeah, there's something about it that facts by themselves just don't motivate people in the same way. There's something about stories
right.
that'll get to the heart. So
Yeah,
yeah,
and my editor at Broadleaf actually, when she was reading all of the 50 stories, she'd come back to some and say, "Oh, this one like has heart." And this one feels like it's more like biography. You need to go back and give it the energy,
right,
and so that is something that we collectively tried to do. So I would go
nice.
back and yeah, how do you write something that tugs at someone, that
Yeah.
has that's the goal as a writer, I guess.
Yeah, I think that would it could be something we would add to the Catherine Hayhoe statement. That, you know, it's best thing to do is talk about it and maybe talk about it in a way that tugs on the heart. And that in
Right,
particular, we need to inform the brain and all that stuff, of course. But something, you know, seems so crucial about making sure that we can tell it as a story and that people feel moved, and
right.
then they will care. Once people start
Or
to
they,
think about what they
yeah,
care about, then we can talk about what we care about. We can talk about how to make the world the more beautiful place that we all know
right.
is possible. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's empowering.
Well, and just to share the Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, who I is Miss New York. um, um, she's about to have a book come out, and it's called um, one of the subheading, I believe, is what if we got this right? Um,
That's good.
yeah, and it's going to be a great book because she's been working on these issues for her whole life.
Yeah.
Um, but but that question, I sit with that question as a different way to look at what we're facing.
Yeah. Oh, I like that a lot. And what if we got this right? Well, I think the kind of work that you're sharing with us is a good example of how to get there. Once we start thinking about, wait a second, look at the whole country, look at the stories that are out there. We might be able to get this thing right.
Fingers crossed.
It doesn't hurt. I'll take a couple of crossed fingers.
Yeah.
Every
And
little
toes.
bit helps. Yeah, get those toes in there. That's good. Well, I can't think of a better note to end on. That's nice, hopeful note. We might be able to get this right. Keep your fingers crossed and keep talking about it. Well, geez, Mallory, thanks so much for sharing your time with us and for putting this book together. It's really quite a treasure.
Thank you, Sam.
And thanks to everybody for tuning in. We'll be back with some more conversations for you later. And in the meantime, take care and be well.